Hello. This is going to be another theory monologue. This one's a theory I've had since I first played through the game. Now, there isn't as much to this one as some of my other ones, so some of this might sound like a stretch to some people. Still, there are a bunch of things in this game that suggest to me that this is true. And of course, a DLC in the near future could prove me right, or it could end up blowing this theory straight out of the water, but more on that later. Now, I really want to be clear about this from the get-go. This is not a new discovery. I haven't uncovered something in the game that no one else has seen yet. This is purely speculation based on what I found in the game that supports my theory. It was all done in good fun. Keep in mind, too, that someone could very well have a different interpretation of some of these things, but for the purposes of presentation, I might start speaking as if my take is just a given. To start off, I need to preface that Cyberpunk 2077 is an action-adventure RPG. I actually can't understand why some people insist this isn't an RPG. You build your character, you assign the attributes, you pick the skills, you choose the dialogue, you decide how to finish missions, and even how a lot of missions end. The game and other characters actually recognize your choices, and most of the time you control V's personality. There are even times when the game implements stat checks so that your attributes decide what you can say or what you can do and what you can't. Now, I do think that 77 could have done better in the role-playing department, but that's a whole different video. Now, the reason I bring this up is that a lot of computer role-playing games try to find a balance between a predefined protagonist and a total blank slate for players to make what they want. There are almost always certain things already established about this character in the narrative and the setting, but while some games try to leave everything from appearance to gender to personal history in the player's hands, other games give the player a very specific character with pre-written backstories and a standard personality, and let them play that character however they want. Cyberpunk sits somewhere in between. The game tells us that V's name stands for Vincent or for Valerie, depending on gender. From a conversation with Takamura, the game tells us that V grew up in Night City if you picked Corpo or Street Kid as your life path, or out in the Badlands if you picked Nomad. The game also tells us that any version of V you make has at least some experience being a netrunner and a solo. But one thing the game never sheds too much light on is V's past, at least not in a concrete way in most cases. Now, this could have all been a conscious choice by CDPR to let the players imagine V as whoever they want them to be. I'd actually say that's quite commendable, and even with what I'm about to say, I think it could still apply. No matter what V's life path, we never learn exactly how V grew up, and we never quite find out what V was doing before the game, or before they met Jackie. We get some inklings here and there, and just from the life path descriptions we have a few ideas, but there's nothing definitive. But there's actually one major detail about V's past we actually can find in the game.
If they're no use to you, they don't work. Just hand them over.
You're the same as them! Rippers, politicians! The same as that fucking Holt!
I could think of a few differences.
Shut up! That bastard he stole from research! He doesn't care about the sick! But soon, I'll find him. End him.
A Militech HKS-47 with polymer reinforcement. You were a soldier.
Militech, 3rd Light Division, 155th Infantry Regiment. 7 years in a fucking jungle. When times were simpler.
Before you got sick.
It cast me out like a dead battery.
That's no reason to become a terrorist. Where'd you serve?
Brazil. Remember all of it. Dirt on my face. Fatigues always wet. It's like a brain dance. I can't shut off.
The memories flood back.
Without the adrenaline. Without my brothers. Fuck. So quickly they forgot me.
those two in the army?
Scorpion Mitch? Yeah, Panzer boys. They're on contract during the last war.
Panzer boys. Flew those huge transporters.
Scorpion piloted. Mitch ran security. They both got some kick-ass combat implants and a stack of really fucked up nightmares.
I remember the chemical stench of the canal, where we boys washed our shirts. Corporate transporters sometimes passed through our slum. Arasaka selecting children, but only the clean ones.
Transporters, you say?
Armored and armed. Chiba 11 had the most murders in all Japan. It probably still has.
Let me guess. So they could turn them into Corvo soldiers?
Exactly. When they chose me, I felt I had won the lottery.
Back during the war, before we were first deployed, we were trained to keep stress in check. Do you want to know how?
How?
They gave us chem cocktails. Supplements, boosters, God knows what else. They shot them into our veins. Our biomons went wild, but only for a second before stabilizing, and boy did we stabilize. After a dozen sessions, something clicks in your brain. Neural pathways get rewired. The part of you that generates fear is zapped into oblivion.
Thought they banned chem cocktails. During the war, even.
Please.
Weren't there outbreaks of cyberpsychosis within units?
And? Do you think Militech gave a lick about that? They just airlifted the afflicted to their clinics in Taiwan. Daily flights. And every day we'd get fresh recruits. Still they pumped us with that shit. But hey, we couldn't argue with the money.
But right here's Jackson Plains. Narrow corridor, just outside the city, and just out of Kang Tao's reach.
Guess it's your lucky day.
Dead zone. I'll grab them there.
Gonna need a native to the area. Someone who'll set up the op, cobble together the gear.
Even tracking that AV would be a bitch. Familiar with the type. Saw legacy models flying around during the war. They're mammoth, but they're quick. Plus they pack next-gen defenses. Can't take pot shots at it. Not even with serious firepower. Just won't work.
V has military experience, having fought in the Unification War. There are lines that show V seems quite familiar with military hardware or military history, but the most crucial piece of evidence comes when V and Rogue are discussing how to ambush Hellman's AV out in the Badlands. Now, for at least some people, what I just showed actually opens the door to a question of whether what we get from stat checks actually apply to V in general, or only to a V with that level in that attribute. What V reveals in Lifepath dialogues only apply to a V with that Lifepath, since that information is actually different depending on which Lifepath you take. If this thought entered your mind though, then just consider that it doesn't actually change the theory at its core. V on any life path can have any levels in any attributes that you want. If V was only in the military when you assign a high enough body stat, then so be it. Then the theory applies to that V. Personally, though, I'm of the opinion that this could be true for all characters, regardless of your attributes, since V makes that observation to Pan Am without any stat checks at all. And when you look at those dialogue prompts I actually clicked on, they read like these are thoughts that enter V's head mid-conversation rather than actual references to personal experiences. Meaning just because V didn't think to say these things, it doesn't always mean V didn't know them. It's only when V says the lines that we get more details to it, like when V mentions being in the war to Rogue during that mission. With all that in mind, V was almost certainly in the military, but I think there's even more to it than that. I actually think there's enough in this game to suggest that V was actually a soldier for the NUSA government. At the risk of telling people what they already know, I'm gonna try to go over the lore that relates to this theory. CDPR and the creator of the original Cyberpunk series, Mike Pondsmith, actually collaborated to create the lore around 2077 specifically, and while it's supposed to line up with Cyberpunk Red and whatnot, I'm only referencing 77 stuff here. If you didn't catch any of this in the game or anywhere else, basically the story goes that 9 years earlier, the new United States elects President Rosalind Myers. By this point, there are a bunch of states that have declared themselves independent from the new American government and call themselves free states. And by 2069, she declares war on all of them to try to bring them back under the control of the NUSA. California was already a free state divided into two, but the war changes things. Northern California, or NorCal, fights to stay independent, while Southern California, or SoCal, joins the NUSA. Night City is originally part of NorCal, but throughout the war it tries to stay out of the fight. The war itself is brutal, and both sides bring out the most devastating war machines and cybernetic soldiers they can produce, to the point where people in 2077 actually remember it as the Metal Wars. And behind all the fighting are the two largest megacorporations we run into during the game. The NUSA government works hand in hand with Militech, while the Free States are secretly backed by Arasaka. The NUSA army nearly invades Night City until Lucius Rhyne convinces Arasaka to openly enter the war in full force, forcing the NUSA to back down and renegotiate with the Free States. Night City becomes independent. The NUSA and Militech agree to let the Free States run themselves, while they agree to become part of the government, and Arasaka regains power in America. The wiki tells us where we can find V's birth date in the game, and according to this, V is pushing 28 in 2077. Since this war happened in 2069, V would have been 20 years old at the time. Now, V never actually talks about where they fought in the war or what they were doing, or anything too specific, but there are a few things in the game I think suggest V fought for the NUSA's side. When it comes to clothing and armor, there are lots of items V can wear that you can actually see on other characters around the game. There are shoes, pants, jackets, or shirts that look identical to things you see on NPCs, but there are also lots of items that you only ever see on V. There are brands that show up again and again on different clothing sets, but the ones that caught my eye the most were the ones that proudly showed off support for the NUSA. These ones I'm showing are a t-shirt, a hat, and a leather vest. I actually remember seeing other ones, but these were the only ones I had in my inventory on a save. All of these are labeled NUSA, and they all feature the NUSA flag in some way. While pretty much no one in the Cyberpunk universe cares about decorousness or propriety when it comes to gore or sex, when you consider the fact that there are probably veterans from both sides all around Night City, these items would probably be considered the most controversial things you could wear around some people. But it's not just that these are in the game. I've checked all around the map, and no NPC anywhere can be found wearing any of these items. None of the ones on the street, none of the named NPCs, not even the members of 6th Street will spawn with any of these items, even though they all openly wear other pieces of clothing that show NUSA allegiance. That means these are special for V. These are exactly the things that someone who fought for the NUSA would wear, and what's interesting here is that there are absolutely no Free State alternatives that I could find anywhere in the game. No shirts, no hats, no jackets, not one thing affiliated with any of the Free States. Given that NorCal is so close by and actually featured in the game's database, I'd have thought you might find NorCal equivalents at least, but I've never seen any. Now, even with the total exclusion of the Free States, this on its own could easily be happenstance, but it actually pairs up perfectly with something much more important. One more thing that supports my theory is found in character creation at the beginning of the game. You can choose from 11 sets of face tattoos and 5 sets of body tattoos. The first set looks like it was designed for a street kid V. These are basically tattoos straight out of Haywood, and they look like what you'd find on any Valentinos walking around in Night City. They're filled with Spanish words, Spanish phrases, or Mexican symbols. There's another set that are made up of samurai tattoos. The snake looks like the one Johnny has on his hand, the goat skull looks like the one Johnny gets from Cassius Ryder, and the lettering underneath it is the lyrics to Chippin' In. There are also two other body sets that I couldn't make heads or tails of. These just look like ordinary tattoos to me, but who knows. If you happen to see this and you know what these are or what they're referencing, please tell me. It would be pretty cool if they were a nod to some other series or something in universe. But the one that really makes this theory is set number 5. These are very clearly military tattoos, with a lot of war imagery and even references to the Metal Wars. But most importantly, we see bald eagles, the NUSA flag, a pit bull wearing an NUSA uniform, and on V's left arm there's an NUSA badge. There are also dates that read April 20th, 2069, November 22nd, and November 14th. It could be those are supposed to be important dates in the war or something else entirely, but that's not really clear to me. Again, we know V was present in the war, and we know the Free States were directly at war with the NUSA. Someone allied with the Free States shouldn't be showing support for the NUSA like this, and again, there is also no Free States equivalent to this set in the game. I think the fact that the game is clearly pointing at the NUSA is no different than them pointing at Haywood or at Samurai. Right after character creation, we can find out that Street Kid V was born and raised in Haywood, and in the Ballad of Buck Ravers, V can outright tell Kareem that they at least used to be a Samurai fan. It's not so inconceivable that V could have fought for the NUSA 7 years earlier. Now, the reason I actually think it has to be the NUSA military specifically is because of something Corpo V says to Meredith Stout.
Do a sweep, now. Now listen, this piece of shit, Anthony Gilchrist, is he your contact? Is he the one who leaked intel on the convoy?
Got no ties to Militech. None.
Checks out.
So how the fuck do you know so much?
That alone is only Corpo V's background, but it got me wondering. I've looked through old videos, loaded up old saves, and searched through the wiki, and as far as I know, V doesn't have any dialogue or any moment in the game that ties into Militech at all on any life path. So this most likely makes that statement true for every single version of V in the game. And we already know that the NUSA was supported by Militech, and that the Free States were supported by Arasaka. And assuming that everything I've said so far is correct, V having no connections to Militech whatsoever means V only could have fought for the NUSA army. Now, there is something here that could make this theory very interesting, especially in the future. If we take a look at set number 5 again, we see that one of these tattoos clearly reads AWOL and Proud. It's part of another tattoo of a cybernetic skull wearing a number 13 beret with a timer in its eye set to explode, and a shattered mirror under a gold eagle next to a cybernetic pit bull. These don't reflect well on the war at all. It kind of calls to mind how Mitch and the other Aldecaldos feel about their time in the military in general, but it also sheds some light on a few things in particular. Remember that any life path you choose has no effect on any of the supporting information I've shown so far, but Corpo V works for Arasaka, and we know from what we find on V's computer that at the very least, V's spent 2 years working in Arasaka counterintelligence. Since Arasaka was an enemy of the NUSA, it wouldn't make much sense for them to hire a former NUSA soldier, even after the war. Street Kid V, more than any of the others, has a very deep connection to Night City, and has special dialogues discussing this throughout the game. It might seem problematic then that V fought for the NUSA when we know that the NUSA very nearly invaded Night City. And then there's the Nomad prologue, which actually takes place down in SoCal, where Nomad V has this to say about the SoCal government.
Served in Spec Ops during the last war. Silver Shoguns? Ring any bells? Don't like to get along, do ya?
Are you one of those who believe everything the talking heads say? The nomads are the world's greatest evil?
No. I'm a man that respects order. Corpse brought us that order, and I intend for it to stay that way.
The corpse pay you and have you on a leash like a dog. You know that?
Mm-hmm. But you don't want to see me bare my fangs. So I'll ask again. Where's your clan?
Now, this doesn't sound like someone who would support the NUSA. Neither does someone who spends at least 2 years working for an enemy corporation after the war, or someone who holds Night City so close to themselves. But what all three of these have in common with one another is that they all work if he chose to desert the NUSA and eventually returned home. Someone who's disgusted with NUSA tactics and or politics, who has some amount of reverence for Night City, and who's AWOL and proud, could easily become any of the three V's that we see in the game. There's also one more thing that really puts all of this stuff into context. This next piece of the theory started when I noticed how obscure the Free States are in this game. Aside from data shards, database entries, or the odd news story, I can't remember a single solid mention of the Free States in general. I can't remember a single person in the game who actually says they fought for the Free States, or who actually mentions an important figure from the Free States at all. In regards to this topic, 77 seems very NUSA-centric, and in fact, I actually think that references to the Free States could have been written out of the game when the lore changed during development, or when CDPR decided to do something different at one point. In the 48-minute preview to the game, we actually see it telling us Night City is still a part of the Free State of North California. This is a direct contradiction to what the game is telling us now. Also, this preview mentions that Johnny Silverhand's last ride had been a year ago. It's not just an offhanded mention that we'd naturally sum up to a mistake, but Stanley the DJ elaborately commemorates Johnny Silverhand and tells us that he died last year. And in the actual game, when you look at Mitch's database entry, it still says very clearly that he and other Aldecados fought for the Free States. But when you talk to Mitch near the end of the game, he very clearly tells you he fought for Militech. Again, this shouldn't just be some oversight, because he clearly says that Militech was ignoring regulations and injecting their soldiers with chemical cocktails, and were shipping those who developed cyberpsychosis off to their clinics in Taiwan. Also, Mitch, Carol, Cassidy, and Bob all talk about fighting in Mexico. Saul even talks about fighting in Africa. I have a very hard time believing that the Free States were sending people overseas at all, but we know for a fact from talking to Corporal Hare that Militech was sending its soldiers to foreign countries 7 years ago, meaning during or just after the Unification War. So either these are all just coincidental errors in the writing process, or things were changed at some point. Either way though, if V fought for the Free States, V might be the only character in the entire game that did so. So with all of this stuff said, I think it would be very unlikely. I think there's definitely enough to prove that V was in the military. It even makes sense that someone trying to be a solo would have military training. But when you take all of these things together, it really leaves the door open on the idea that V fought for the NUSA specifically. And I'm going as far as thinking CDPR was specifically hinting at this in the game. But even if they weren't, there's nothing that stops this from being true. And this is where I think bits could actually make for RPG gold in future materials. When we saw the 48-minute preview, character creation left a lot of V's personal history in the player's hands, childhood heroes, personal motives, and important life events. Imagine a DLC where V is asked what was an important life event for them, and the player chooses military service. Even with everything I just said about the NUSA, it would be so easy to introduce new content that makes the opposite just as possible. Imagine meeting other characters and being asked if you fought for NorCal or for SoCal. In Night City, 6th Street members openly talk about their support for the NUSA and the reunification of America, and I remember finding pro-Rosalind Myers data shards around their hangouts. One of the endings to the game involves going off to Arizona with Pan Am though, and Arizona is apparently a free state. A DLC involving Arizona could very easily show us the other side to all of this. Imagine if the player gets to choose which side V stood on, and making that choice means certain characters won't work with you, or certain groups might shoot you on sight. Hell, imagine characters reacting to those tattoos, or finding out that V is AWOL from the NUSA army. This level of player choice and reactivity is exactly what lots of people were looking for in this game. It's the kind of thing you found in games like KOTOR 1 or KOTOR 2, and it gives players the freedom to roleplay and make decisions in the game the way we did in The Witcher. On top of all this, it would really add more to V as a character, and would really give players a chance to explore one of the more interesting parts of Cyberpunk's lore in a different way, since endless conflicts and corporate power plays are all we ever hear about in the series. This would really let us explore that from a completely different angle, and it would show us these things in a completely different way. Anyways, I think that's everything I had to say on this topic. In conclusion, I think there's enough in this game to suggest that V could have fought for the NUSA government against the Free States at one point long before the game started. If anyone's actually watching, if you think I missed something, feel free to tell me. If you have a different take on something I showed, or if you think I misinterpreted something, I'd love to discuss it. If there's something I got wrong, tell me that too. Alright, thanks for watching anyone.